Imagine you're living thousands of years ago. There are no supermarkets, no refrigerators, no food labels, no doctors telling you what's safe to eat. And then one day, you see a strange liquid coming from an animal. White, warm, rich. You've never seen anything like it before. So here's the question. Who was the first human brave enough to drink milk? And even more importantly, how did ancient humans discover that milk was safe to drink? Because milk doesn't come with instructions. You can't look at it and immediately know whether it will nourish you or make you violently sick. And yet, at some point in human history, people began drinking the milk of animals like cows, goats, and sheep. Eventually, dairy became one of the most important foods in human civilization. But the story probably didn't begin with someone simply deciding, let's drink that. It was likely much more accidental. To understand how it happened, we need to go back thousands of years to a time when humans were beginning to live alongside domesticated animals. Imagine an early farming community. Instead of constantly hunting wild animals, people are raising goats, sheep, and cattle. These animals provide something extremely valuable: meat, hides, bones, and eventually, milk. But there's an important problem. Milk is designed for babies. Every mammal produces milk to feed its young. Humans already understood this. Human mothers breastfed their babies, so ancient people would have been familiar with the basic idea that milk was food. But animal milk was different, and the first people to encounter it may not have immediately thought about drinking it themselves. They may have watched something much simpler: a baby animal nursing from its mother. Perhaps someone noticed that the young animal became stronger and healthier after feeding. That would have provided an important clue. There is nourishment inside this strange white liquid. But how would humans get it? One possibility is that ancient people first discovered milk while handling pregnant or nursing animals. A goat or sheep might have been restrained. Its offspring might have been nearby. And someone could have accidentally squeezed the animal's udder. A few drops appeared. What happens next? Maybe someone touched the liquid. Maybe they smelled it. Maybe they tasted a tiny amount. And if nothing bad happened, they remembered. That tiny experiment could have been repeated, and repeated, and eventually, people would have learned that milk could be collected deliberately. But there was still another problem. How did they know how much was safe? They didn't have modern microbiology. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand lactose. They had no concept of pathogens. They learned through observation. And that kind of knowledge could be surprisingly powerful. If a certain animal consistently produced milk that people could consume without obvious problems, humans would remember. If a particular method of collecting or storing milk caused illness, people could learn to avoid it. Over generations, these observations became practical knowledge. But there's another fascinating clue in the archaeological record. Humans weren't simply drinking fresh milk. They were processing it. And this may have been incredibly important. Archaeologists have discovered evidence suggesting that dairy processing goes back thousands of years. Ancient pottery from early farming societies contains chemical traces consistent with milk fats. Some of the oldest evidence comes from pottery associated with Neolithic communities. And researchers have also found evidence of ancient cheese production. Why would people turn milk into cheese? Because there's a major advantage. Cheese lasts much longer than fresh milk. And it changes the chemistry of milk. Fresh milk contains lactose, the natural sugar in milk. Many adult humans cannot digest large amounts of lactose efficiently. That's because the production of lactase, the enzyme needed to digest lactose, usually decreases after childhood in populations without a long history of dairying. But fermentation changes things. Bacteria consume some of the lactose. That means fermented dairy products can be easier for many lactose-intolerant people to digest. So ancient humans may not have needed to drink huge quantities of fresh milk. They could process it into foods that were easier to store and consume. Curds, cheese, yogurt-like fermented products, butter. This raises an incredible possibility. Maybe the history of dairy wasn't really about drinking milk at all. Maybe it was about learning how to transform it. Think about what that would mean for an ancient farming community. A cow produces milk every day. But you can't preserve fresh milk indefinitely. Without refrigeration, it spoils quickly. But if you turn that milk into cheese, suddenly you have something much more useful. A portable source of calories, fat, and protein. Something that can potentially be stored. Something that can be transported. Something that can survive beyond the day it was produced. And that could have made dairy incredibly valuable. But there's another mystery. When did humans evolve the ability to drink milk comfortably as adults? This is where human genetics becomes part of the story. Most mammals stop producing large amounts of lactase after weaning. Humans were no different for most of our evolutionary history. But in some populations with long traditions of cattle or other dairy farming, genetic mutations evolved that allowed adults to continue producing lactase. This is called lactase persistence. And it is one of the clearest examples of human evolution responding to cultural change. Humans began keeping animals for milk. Then, over many generations, some populations developed genetic adaptations that made consuming fresh milk easier. In other words, the animals changed human culture, and human culture changed human biology. But this process didn't happen everywhere. Some populations developed high levels of lactase persistence. Others remained largely lactose intolerant as adults. And that tells us something important. There probably wasn't one single moment when humans discovered milk. It was a long process, a chain of tiny discoveries. A person noticing an animal nursing. Someone collecting a few drops. Someone tasting them. Someone realizing milk could be stored. Someone discovering fermentation. Someone making cheese. And generations of people learning which animals, foods, and techniques worked best. So perhaps the first human to drink animal milk wasn't a genius inventor. Maybe they were simply curious. Maybe they were hungry. Maybe they were experimenting with everything around them, just as humans have always done. And that makes the story even more fascinating. Because today, drinking milk feels completely ordinary. You pour it into a glass. You put it in your cereal. You turn it into cheese, butter, yogurt, and countless other foods. But behind that ordinary glass of milk is a story thousands of years old. A story that began when humans first started looking at domesticated animals and asking, what else can this animal provide? We may never know exactly who tasted animal milk first. We may never know what they were thinking. But we can follow the clues they left behind. Pottery, animal bones, ancient dairy residues, cheese-making evidence. And even changes written into human DNA. Together, these clues tell us something remarkable. The discovery of milk wasn't one dramatic moment. It was thousands of small experiments. Thousands of observations. Thousands of generations of people learning from animals. Learning from food, and learning from their own bodies. And perhaps that is how many of humanity's greatest discoveries really happened. Not with a scientist standing in a laboratory. But with an ordinary human looking at something strange. Wondering what it could do. And deciding to take the smallest, riskiest sip. Because sometimes, civilization begins with curiosity.